Hi, this is Paul. I've been working my sources. A number of you have been sending me eyewitness accounts of the Vancouver, especially the first Vancouver talk. I've been reading reports on Reddit, so on and so forth, and had a couple of conversations with, I have a number of ongoing conversations with a number of you via email or sometimes Skype and this, and usually brief conversations. And my watchers keep pushing me, and so one of the questions I was talking with someone this morning was someone who actually went to the events in Vancouver. Why do we do these events? Why do we listen? What's going on with them? Well, one of the things that I mentioned to the friend I was talking to is that status binds and blinds, and we're not expecting to see either Sam Harris or Jordan Peterson flip on stage. They have a large following which generates and rewards the ego. There are financial rewards. You're not going to flip in front of a theater of your adoring fans, and everyone wants to see the other side flip, and that's sort of the sport of it. And we talked about the fact that, according to this individual that was at the first event in Vancouver, Sam Harris's demeanor was kind of relaxed and comfortable, and he just had his arguments ready, lined up, and it was kind of a tower defense game. Jordan Peterson comes out, boom, hit that argument, boom, hit that argument. Jordan Peterson seemed much more engaged, and I think this is something that we've seen in Jordan Peterson. I think partly this is a function because he hasn't been in the game as long, and he's had so many years outside of the game. And as I often say about YouTube, YouTube is a place for people who have very little to lose. And so Jordan Peterson in that way is kind of an anomaly. Sam Harris came into this game much earlier in life. He has a lot more to lose in terms of status. And so just in terms of that dynamic, we'll see fewer things. Well, there's less chance that he'll flip on much of anything or evolve on too much. But people do flip and people do evolve. Late in life, some people who've been long-term atheists become theists. Some people who've been long-term theists become atheists. This flipping does happen, but what happens is that the higher up you get up the hierarchy, the more status you accumulate, those all become pressures holding you to your position. And so in that way, it's kind of nice to talk about to people like me who are far lower status. And I know you're watching me through YouTube, and there's funny tricks in your mind that I somehow am a celebrity. If you visit my church once, you'll be immediately disavowed of that, because it is not the case that my church is busting at the seams and people are waiting in line. I have a rather unusual queue in my email, perhaps, and on my Facebook page, and a few more Twitter followers. But for the most part, I am not really anything special in this conversation. Now, the naturalist-materialist framework its faults have been known for at least 100 years, and its faults have been exposed for at least 100 years. And if you go back and read the conversations, a lot of the arguments are old, and I've trotted out a lot of these very old arguments. Now, what's interesting, again, is that we're expecting people to flip. Well, people don't necessarily flip. This isn't how people work. And this, in fact, I think is part of the weakness of the kind of the Sam Harris approach to this, because it assumes that if I get the right evidence, I'll flip. Well, I am not quite that rational. I have committed biases through and through me, and I am hardly just someone looking at evidence and doing math and saying, he has 20 points, he has 15 points, therefore I'll side with him. Our lives are enormously more complicated. We're embedded in families. We're embedded in cultures, we're embedded in jobs, we're embedded in religion, we're embedded in all of these things, and these things keep us sticky. And in my last video where I talked about I should go look at that Oneida book, but they talked about they didn't want sticky relationships in the commune, because they wanted the great leader of the commune to make rational decisions based on, well, you should make a child because that child will have the best of your quality and the best of this quality, and so on and so forth. But people aren't that way, and this is, in a sense, part of the difference between economically communist central planning and our faith in the marketplace. Part of what the West has brought to the table in terms of these conversations has been saying, look, the market is far more complex than any single one of us, even with computers, can manage. Therefore, we're better off riding the elephant, even if we can't finally control it, and trying to do a little bit of adjustment, the elephant in this case being the marketplace, because in some senses, the inbuilt chaos and order that the living elephant or a well-functioning marketplace produces, even though there are dramatic downsides to it, such as inequality, poverty, so on and so forth, in the long run, it's better. And so you hear people having the economic argument that capitalism actually performs better in terms of lifting people out of poverty than communism. And you can look at the history of mainland China for that conversation, that capitalism has been far more successful. But, of course, there are costs to it. But the naturalist-materialist paradigm has remained the dominant paradigm in the public order in the West. It is dominant in the academy. It is dominant in the political sphere of the capitalist democracies in the West. And it was dominant in the former Soviet and the former communist world. Now, here's where this begins to evolve and slip, because I think in a sense Peterson is enough of a naturalist materialist that he's watching, and naturalism materialism is only one aspect of that of our very complex culture, of this very complex culture. And what we see happening is that this naturalist materialist agnostic atheistic context that has prioritized facts and evidence and science over persons and personalities and woo, we see this slipping. And we see Jonathan Haidt, for example, sounding the alarm that, hey, we are going to lose some of the objectivity that we have enjoyed within that system if we decide that we're not going to take a look at race and IQ, and we're not going to look at biological sex and gender expression. We're not going to talk about these things scientifically because they raise what becomes functionally religious problems. And in that sense, why do Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, why are they have so much alignment in this particular fight? Because they're both, in a sense, they have a great deal more commonality here, but they're looking at the other side and they're saying, I see a religion developing. And of course, Sam Harris, a religion! It's kind of a mouse and an elephant. Oh, it's a religion! And Jordan Peterson saying, oh, I've been looking at religion. I've been studying religion. This is a religion, but this is a new one, and this is a threatening one, and this one could threaten the whole system. Even though Peterson has mostly been attacking Marxism, there's wisps of this other things, and you hear it when Peterson makes the comment to the Sam Harris types when he says, hey, look, you know what? When people give up their religion, they tend to just grab a new one under the covers and work that. And that will be the secret, sacred self. Now, again, Thomas Nagel, and I keep mentioning Thomas Nagel, and you should probably look him up on the Weekly Standard if you're looking for a short thing on the heretic, or a much longer treatment, obviously, Mind and Cosmos. Thomas Nagel comes around and says, okay, let's call it on materialist naturalism. Because philosophically, the corpse is starting to stink and the decay is starting to show. Now, that might not show at a popular level because there's a drag, but at the philosophical level, it's bankrupt and a lot of people know it. We've gained extraordinary power and success by colonizing. In other words, by reason colonizing nature. Remember, C.S. Lewis wrote in the 50s, in the 40s and 50s, he developed these arguments, and they're already half a century old. And so we've gained tremendous power over the physical layer of our world, and we have impressed ourselves by this power, and we are for the most part happy with this transactions, and we always tend to moderate them. It's no mystery that national parks came about as, in a sense, a compensating response to our increased colonization of nature. We began to mourn the mother that we had been colonizing. It's in a sense we go over to the slave quarters to look at mom and thinking, boy, mom isn't looking so good. We've really been using mom hard, and well, let's cut out a little place over in Yellowstone and Yosemite and maybe a few other places where mom can get a breather. Well, and now here at the end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st century, the health of mom is in a pretty dramatic panic, because we're realizing that if mom goes, we all might go, because mom is at least half of us. So, Thomas Nagel is getting into this naturalism, materialism. This approach to the physical world has been enormously fruitful, but it has also had dramatic costs. And we're not so sure, our watchers are not so sure, that keeping up this approach with mom will really do good things long term. In a sense, maybe we should stop colonizing mom quite so hard and give her a little bit more time off to breathe. So in the 20th century, we saw the bitter fruits of that. And we're not going, and now Nagel comes along and says part of the problem is the mind. And Peterson makes the same point in Transliminal 2015, that we were able to colonize by reducing the mind and imagining the monarchical vision of taking out persons and stripping nature down into a space for objects and looking at things in a Newtonian fashion. And it worked really powerfully and it worked really well. But Nagel comes along and says you can't just insert mind back into the system. And I think probably the best way to understand Sam Harris is this is what he's trying to do. But you almost get the sense with Sam Harris that, so you've got this big old book of nature, and we're going to set mind on top, or we're going to set mind next to it, but you're not really integrating these books very well. That isn't really happening, and that's at least what Thomas Nagel says. Now, Nagel says, theism was the older system, and the advantage that theism had was mind was already integrated from the start. But he notes Thomas Nagel is an atheist, and I've used the quote before where he doesn't want to be a theist. He doesn't want there to be a God. So now we're knocking on Augustine's door and talking about desire, and the heart wants what it wants, Woody Allen. The foundational mind, and here's the thing, we inherit mind from our Father in heaven. Or we are given mind from the gods via the Greeks. Or I'm sure the Hindus and most cultures have mythologies that talk about how we got conscious and how we got powerful, and how you have the gods, you have nature, and we're kind of in the middle space. And in fact, the Genesis story has God and nature and us. And now you read the book of Hebrews, we're a little lower than the angels. So, now you've got another layer of what missionaries have been talking about, the excluded middle layer. But the foundational mind, which is God, had claims on the derivative mind, who are us. And the cost was loss of freedom and autonomy. And this is, in fact, in many ways, the central struggle of Genesis 3. The man and the woman are placed in the garden, and they're told, go ahead and make culture. And they begin to think, well, maybe I'd like to go up a level, and maybe God is being withholding. And that's essentially what the serpent suggests to them. And they, in a sense, say what the son of Luke 15 says to God, says, I really want your stuff, but I don't want you. And in many ways, the materialist, atheist layer says to, at least this is how theists hear it, of course, says to God, we want your stuff and we don't want you. We want to be autonomous. We want to call the shots. We want to be able to pursue what we want, and we don't need any stinking old stories or old man in the sky or flying spaghetti monster hassling us with your archaic rules. We'll be the judge of whether things work. Now, obviously, right there, well, slavery worked well for the master, sort of. Slavery didn't work well for the slave. And so work is also attached to the mind, because you're not going to segregate work from want. And in fact, a contemporary adaptation of modern language, someone invites you to a dinner or someone asks you to do something and you say, well, that doesn't work for me. And that's a nice social way of saying, no. But I don't want to say no because I don't want to rupture the relationship, so that doesn't work for me. And in a sense, what naturalists say is that, okay, we like the stuff. We're not, now we have at least we have a cover story about how all this stuff came about without you. That was Darwin's big addition. So even if some of the best chemists say, no, we really don't have any idea how prebiotic life could become biochemistry. We have no idea how that would happen. But now we have a cover story, okay? So we don't want you. We'll take the stuff. We seem to work well without you. When we cut down Odin's tree, Odin didn't complain. When I left the church and stopped praying to God, the world didn't end, okay? So maybe you always were a fiction of my imagination. Oh yeah, Freud. Freud says these are deep things inside of me that I'm just projecting up. So, I can probably lose you, God. I want your stuff. I don't want you. So Nagel wants to find a new system with mind already incorporated within it that also affords the autonomy that materialism seemed to promise. And that's Thomas Nagel's goal. That's a very demanding goal because, again, as Nagel said, it seems that we derived all of these benefits of the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution and, all of the world-transforming revolutions we've had without mind. Reintroducing mind suddenly it opens us up to problems, and we don't want to lose what we've gained. And in a sense, this isn't so different from Peterson. We don't want to lose what we've gained. And so, of course, the argument of if it ain't broke, don't fix it, let's just keep going with our project. But now I would say that communally, all of our minds and all of our watchers are always responding to this in ways that the elephants are responding in ways that the riders don't know, and we just keep making up stories. And a lot is happening, and I think this is part of the reintroduction of the secret sacred self. So the naturalist-materialist and mind autonomy problem. Once you remove the divine mind and its claims, you are left with other human minds, and that's part of the problem. They are in some ways more problematic because there are, that should be many of them, not may of them. Now here's the thing with God. God is not only all-powerful and all-knowing, but he's all-good. And that gives a degree of comfort, so that when you're feeling a little ignorant because you're not all-knowing, and if you're feeling a little weak because you're not all-powerful, you can rely on him being all-good. And that, that's the phone. So in one sense, the problem with God is that he's so big and so powerful and so public and has such a following, even though the followers don't always agree. The upside to God is that at least theoretically he's all good, so when things are going poorly, I can at least default to that. So what happens now is that when you're trying to reintroduce mind into the system, you swap power and authority, which is God, for plurality. And now we get into the fun question, would you rather fight a 1 million pound human, which would be God, or 1 million or a million 1 pound humans, which is all the rest of them? And that is, in a sense, the conundrum between a monolithic, monarchical monotheism that has an all-powerful and all-knowing and all-good God versus 8 billion secret sacred selves. Now, they're all little, And not any one of them is quite as powerful as God. They tend to get into hierarchies, and they build institutions that magnify their power. And then we're going to talk about the state in a little while, because there's no bigger institution than governments. Theists resolve this issue by authority and submission. Theists submit to the God. Now, they fight with other theists, so the problem doesn't go away, but theoretically, that's how they solve the problem. And this brings us to an impasse, which is what to do with inconvenient people. Now, with all of the news of immigration, with the talk of children being separated from their families, you've got boats in the Mediterranean that the Italian government doesn't want to let in. You've got Turkey going increasingly authoritarian, and the European Union not wanting to say anything because they're holding 3 million Syrian refugees, and all Turkey has to do is say, "Oh, you're going to criticize us? Why don't we send 3 million Syrian refugees your way? Germany's, kind of choking hard on 1 million. How about we add another 3 million and we see how you do?" And so the European Union says, "We'll shut up about Turkey. We'll let Erdogan do his own thing. We'll sacrifice some of our values that we like to talk a lot about and celebrate ourselves through them for not having those other 3 million refugees." And this is one of the points that Yuval Harari keeps making in his books, and that the future, what we're really going to be dealing with, is inconvenient people. In Europe, do they bring alien culture and religion? And that's part of the conversation. What are you going to do in Europe? You've got Africans, many of whom are Muslims, coming up, and you've got Muslims from the Middle East and Pakistan and Iran and Iraq and Syria and right into the heart of decaying Christendom. And how does that go? And then suddenly everyone was all irreligious and able to be nice to religious people, when all the religious people were Christians, when in many ways you're just kind of like in some ways you're a nominal Christian who's no longer practicing. Well, now you got a whole bunch of Muslims. And again, when you listen to the Peterson, Sam Harris talk, this is something that's huge with Sam Harris, and is there with Peterson too, where it's like, yeah, Christianity, well, we're kind of used to dealing with Christians. I might find a church a little annoying, and I might find Christians a little annoying, but boy, once I have to deal with Muslims, I'd rather deal with Christians, because at least I know where they're coming from, and they've had the Protestant Reformation. And yeah, maybe the Republicans get a little theocratic, but those are theocratics that I can at least deal with. That kind of Christian-y civil religion has been around a long time in the United States, and was, of course, a big part of what we used to fight the Cold War. So what do you do with inconvenient people? Control? Well, people are really difficult to control because they're really smart, and they group up very quickly if you try to get authoritarian on them. And they might not be able to they might not be able to agree upon what the new government will be after they tear yours down, but they can sure get together to tear it down. And we've seen that again and again. Again, my reference to The Who, here's the new boss, same as the old boss. So what happens is you have this motivation to objectify people. And if you look at all of the gains made by the materialist, naturalist conception that we have used to employ to create science and technology and our current regimes of politics, they're deep within this. Why do we want to study psychology? Well, we want to help people. Yeah, but at the same time, we also want to help them be as we think they should be. And this is why, on one level, a therapist wants to help you, but this is why Christians often look for Christian therapists, because Christian will say, well, I want to be shaped in the way that Christ say I should be. And a secular therapist, whether or not they own up to things, has their own framework. And ironically, functionally, many secular therapists have a framework that is a lot like Sam Harris's framework. In other words, are you feeling better? Well, if you go back to the 90s and you look at the great show The Sopranos, they were flirting with those ideas, because Tony Soprano goes to a therapist and says, Dr. Melfi, these panic attacks are getting in the way of my mob bossing. And if you could really help me get away from all this anxiety, I could be a better mob boss. I could be more successful with my syndicate crime family. And suddenly she's like, well, do I really want to make him a better mob boss? And suddenly her moral ideas are starting to come in. And then suddenly you have to ask yourself, well, where do my moral ideas come from? Now, she was also Italian, and so then Roman Catholicism came into the picture, but also secularism. And in other words, and this is a big part of Peterson's point with Sam Harris, and a point of my last couple videos, this imagined clean room morality looks way too much like decaying Christendom or late-stage Christendom to really have me buy that you have surgically removed all the vestiges of Jesus Christ and the Old Testament than you seem to be telling me. I'm not buying it. And the reason I'm not buying it is I know what other systems look like, and you and I are so close together. And this isn't a new problem. In many ways, Jesus is, in the New Testament, at odds with the Pharisees. And if you look at the spectrum of the culture war in Jesus' time, the Pharisees are his closest allies. And this is a common human dynamic. You work in the Dominican Republic. Dominicans have a harder time working with Haitians than North Americans or even Puerto Ricans. Why? Because the Dominicans and Haitians are right there. And this is why other countries will tend to criticize close neighbors, and this is why this is kind of the antagonism that develops over familiarity. You've got a million tiny little friction points between someone's close to you. Someone who's over here, you might only have one or two. So what do you do with inconvenient people? Well, the emergent political paradigm and the emergent paradigm in the academy is not only some implicit Marxism, but is a lot of the secret self. Now, again, David Brooks' book, The Road to Character, is a fun book. If you like biographies, he's got plenty of little ones in there. But the point he's making is the negotiation between Adam 1 and Adam 2. Adam 1 are the resume virtues, and Adam 2 are the eulogy virtues. And in pre-9/11 Christianist America, you know, the greatest generation that fought World War II, there was a lot of Christianity in that system, whether or not people went to church. And then they all tended to go to church during the Cold War because we wanted the Lord to fight. We wanted the Lord to fight communism, kind of in the same way that the Avengers wanted Thor to help fight Thanos. So, you know, this is a big deal. And the cult of the sacred self is an attempt to integrate these tensions. Now, someone asked me again about the fairness of saying Matt Dillahunty and Sam Harris are Christians. Part of the difficulty of running that formula is that by the early 21st century, there's so many historical elements in the river that to say this one is really turning your dials beneath the surface. You know, you have how much Greece is there and how much Athens is there and how much Jerusalem is there in Sam Harris. And so Jordan Peterson kind of wants to wade in and say, there's some Jerusalem, there's some Jerusalem, there's some Jerusalem. And Sam Harris says, no, it's all Athens. Thank you very much. And a lot of us watch and say, there's plenty of Jerusalem and Athens and Thor and your mom and all of this stuff within our constructed selves. And so, in a sense, saying there's vegetables in your stew and there's beef in your stew. Well, there's beef and vegetables in the stew. And they've all been in there for a long time. And so, you know, if you really want to be a very particular vegan, you're going to have to cook the stew new. And at this point, there's no cooking a new stew. And that's part of what Peterson has on his side in this argument. There's no recooking the stew, and you can see that even with the small experiments, like I noted in a video a couple back with the people trying to go to Mars. Well, yeah, we've had Mom in the slave quarter so long, we've been working her so hard, we've colonized her so hard for so long that now we're nervous about her death. Well, yeah, go to Mars and see how that works. There are ways that we are dependent on ideas and systems that we are completely unaware of. And that's part of the reason we are not transparent to ourselves. So you have the secret sacred self, and this is supposed to help us. This is, in a sense, the new paradigm. This is the ascendant morality. The secret sacred self tries to resolve the theism, naturalist, materialism things. In a sense, it tries to bring mind back in. And of course, this is where Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris can look at the New Agers and say, I'm not buying any of that. That's way too much woo. Well, what is the woo? The woo is trying to reintegrate mind into material. The woo is magic. The woo is, that's essentially it. And I hadn't heard this woo term until I started going into all this, and then listening to Jordan Peterson and lately with the one fighter, a video that I mentioned in a few videos back. Well, what is woo? Woo is the attempt to reintroduce the mind back into the material world. And many of us, someone asked, so your church is 250,000 people. That's not my local church, by the way. That is the Christian Reformed denomination in the United States and Canada. It's about 250,000 people. And the question was in the comments, are they secular humanists? And I said, most of them, a lot more than they want to admit, myself included. And one of the ongoing playful tensions I have with my sister and a lot of other people in my life who are a little bit more new agey and post-Christian is I look at them and I say, you've got way too woo, way too much woo in your life. Well, they don't like that. And I didn't have those words before, but again, this woo is the reintroduction of mind into material. So for example, after my father died, my niece, who was driving his old car, the locks freaked out, and stop it, Grandpa, stop playing with the locks, and a bunch of other weird technology things happened. This is where we get into the ghost conversation. And their ghosts and woo are way too close for most secular humanists to admit to or to like. And so one way, in a sense, to navigate so C.S. Lewis, for example, is very modernist. He's very Platonist. And one of the things that, again, if you're a theist, you've got mind integrated into your system, and it's always been there. So when C.S. Lewis converted to Christianity, a big part of why I think his books are seen as being so helpful in the West is he is working on reintegrating woo, reintegrating mind into the rest of it in a way that doesn't trip our woo alarms. Okay? So this is where I think, again, if Peterson, the thing that makes Sam Harris and his tribe, his followers, very nervous about Jordan Peterson is they're really hoping that woo doesn't sneak in. Maybe it's woo-poo or something. So that woo-poo doesn't sneak in. Because, you've got stories, you've got mind that woo's going to sneak in. Well, with the secret sacred self, it's all over. It's woo all the time. And so you deal with theism by making myself God. Namaste, the God in me sees the God in you. We're all God. Okay? Well, that's kind of one way to deal with pluralism, but whose God is stronger? And it's everything is one. Therefore, none of us are in competition with each other. And most of us sit back and watch that and think, you know what? I'm not quite so sure we're going to get rid of these hierarchies. So again, when you think about Jordan Peterson is kind of barking at, you've got postmodernity that says there can't be a narrative, and then Marxism sneaks in underneath, and Jordan Peterson is sort of like the guard dog who's barking, "Ah, Marxism! Don't let the Marxist in." Well, another thing that's sneaking in underneath is woo. And that's in a sense what Sam Harris is barking at. Don't let the woo in. And Peterson's like, maybe we could use a little woo. And Thomas Nagel says, we got to come to terms with our lack of woo. And Sam Harris says, no woo. No woo. I can't take any woo, okay? And so the secret sacred self people are like, hey, man, go with the woo. The woo is great. And Harris and Peterson look at that coming into the university, and they're both barking for slightly different reasons. So what the secret sacred self relies on is polytheism, and it's kind of hyper polytheism, because not only are there multiple gods, everything is God, and we're all God. But that also requires kind of a functional libertarianism, where, you do you, I'll do me. And that also is deep in our culture. And again, if you look at Harari and, well, not Harari actually, but Scott Alexander, and the article that I posted on the West 2 videos ago, how does what Scott Alexander calls universal culture work with us? It's because we allow quite a bit of individual autonomy. And you see, this is not new. This has been built into, let's say, the separation of church and state. That has been the American experiment in the federal government for over 200 years. And the idea is, I can be a Christian, you can be a Muslim, you can love woo, you can hate God, we can all do this, and we can all be Americans together. Well, how does that work? We need to all revolve around something. Take again a look again at Jonathan Haidt's the rationalist. Someone will put it in the comment section. Basically the rationalist illusion. No, you got to circle around something, and so you've got the Iwo Jima statue, and we circle around the flagpole. And when Christians go out and pray by the flagpole, as someone who was hyper about civil religion back during the Cold War, it's like, is that really where you want to pray? Well, now we're getting into a bunch of U.S. political things. So the secret sacred self people resolve the story moment problem by they're not just a secret sacred self. The self is a story, which I think is true, and they are the hero of their own story. And this is the woo business, that I can be at home and I can work my woo, and nobody in the world quite understands the world like I do. And, God bless them. We're all God and we're all one, but I'm a little bit more God than them. And I'm a little bit more in touch with my godness than they are. And my godness is a little bit more in touch. And now most of us listening will say, this just sounds like, self-centered bias than anything else. And Christians play in this too. When I get to the pearly gates, God is going to be like, oh, here comes Paul Vanderklay. Open the gates wide and let him come in. Instead of saying, hey, Paul, look what you did with your life. Look at all these ways you messed it up. It's my inner Calvinist in me saying, don't get too impressed with yourself. Difficulties remain, however, for the secret sacred self. The individual sacred self is materially dependent upon the state. And I've seen this often. Again, I live in Northern California. I have friends that, I don't want to make money. Well, soon as they don't have money, making money sounds like a whole lot better deal. I'd really love to have the state take care of me, or I'd like to have someone else take care of me. And just as you have prosperity gospel in Christianity, you got a lot of prosperity gospel in the New Age moment. I'm going to use the law of attraction, and I am going to draw to myself wealth and abundance. And pretty soon we're up there in Oregon with the Bhagwan. If you haven't watched Wild Wild Country, definitely don't miss it on Netflix. So the individual sacred self is materially dependent upon the state. And a lot of this, again, Harari is good in this, in the history of Sapiens. Family has been replaced, and family has been replaced by the state. and the state and the market too. And in the West, we modulate state and market in different ways than, let's say, Central Europe or Western Europe, from Central Europe, from former communist Union, so on and so forth. Family has been replaced. Now, family is a source of great tension with the God in me, because the people you spar with most of the time are the people you live with, because you've got a million things to fight with them over. You also have a huge amount of commonality, and so the commonality and the difference are always in tension. So, why won't my wife recognize the godness person that I am? And she's like, I've seen your godness up close, and I am not impressed. So, and intimate relationships are like this. We not only know each other's glory, we know each other's dirt, and we know each other's flaws. And this is what makes marriage such a difficult thing. In the Brett Weinstein video about monogamy, I thought what he had to say about infatuation was dead on. Infatuation is this early mechanism by which we bond very closely with someone else, and we get completely enmeshed with that other person, only a few years later to realize, look at what I'm enmeshed with. And, well, now you've got a process of differentiation where the other person says, no, you're the problem in my life. No, you're the problem in my life. My life would be great without you. And so, it's 5, 7, 10 years into the marriage, they get a divorce, only to marry a second person who, now they've just triggered their infatuation thing. And, this, as a pastor, I hear this all the time. I found the most perfect person. Really? I'll see in a couple of years when the perfection wears off, and it always does. Well, what happens with the secret sacred self is that, I'm just terribly impressed with me. I'm a god after all. Yeah, you're a god too, but I won't tell you this, but I'm really a much better god than you. And so on we go with these things. So what happens when you're dependent on family for things like care when you're old, for money when you're old, for paying the rent? So, then in a sense, what we've done is that the state and the law come in, and these mediate these things. Plus, we need all this fabulously expensive health care to beat cancer and heart disease when we get older. So you've got physical well-being, health care, retirement. This is why the gender expression individualist issue goes political. In other words, one of the things that people commonly say is, if you want to have the gender identity of Shirley Temple, go right ahead. No, but I want the government to pay for my reassignment surgery. And if I'm going to be Shirley Temple, I really do need an adoring fan base. And in other words, the secret sacred self not only needs expression, say, okay, you're free to express, dress any way you want to. But now this gets complicated. The secret sacred self is also insecure, and it needs affirmation. The government had better reflect my gender identity on my driver's license. So now you can have like male, female, or N, decline to state. Well, that's not really me too. On my driver's license, I want Paul Vanderclay, 225 pounds, 54 years old, gender, Shirley Temple. That's my gender identity. I'm Shirley Temple. I tap dance. I have a lovely voice. I have adults fawn on me. I'm perpetually 7 years old. Why won't the rest of the world comply with that? And so Jordan Peterson will make individual accommodations with people, and that's a reasonable thing to do. But when we get into the level of the government, it's not only compelled speech, it's all of us now must conform to whatever the secret sacred self says. So if I decide that my gender pronouns are His Highness, and I catch you using a gender pronoun other than His Highness, I will sue you into oblivion. Because I had a friend, we had a little basketball league in town here, and my friend was kind of running this league, and so he was signing kids up, and a little kid came up to sign up, and what's your name? Da Man. Da Man? Yeah. demand. Now my friend is black, and the family signing up was black. And my friend freaked the heck out because he's like, DeMann is not a good name. But his name, and so he called the mother over and he read the Mother the Riot Act about DeMann. Well, what kind of name is DeMann? And you might say, well, why are you such a jerk about let the person name whoever they want? Yeah, but DeMann, that's pretty mild. But if I decide to name myself John F. Kennedy and then say, well, I was actually born in the 30s. When was John F. Kennedy born? Earlier than that. But if I decide to rename myself John F. Kennedy, okay, call yourself John F. Kennedy. And I want to adopt his Social Security number. And I want to adopt his estate. And when I walk into the John F. Kennedy Library, I want to be treated as John F. Kennedy. Well, suddenly, individual identity means something. And in fact, we have a thing called identity theft. Well, how, and the state, again, modulates all of this stuff. So when the secret sacred self says, you know, I am actually King Cyrus, and Cyrus the Great, by the way, and I demand to be treated that way. Well, to what degree does the government capitulate to the secret sacred self? That's really where a lot of our political conversations are at now. And that is where the Kathy Newman conversation with Jordan Peterson, well, you're offending people. Yeah, I should. That's part of our job here. Feelings and skin have two different levels on the hierarchy in terms of protection by the state, and it should be that way. So this is why the gender expressive individualist goes political. The state must mediate and affirm. If the state doesn't put Shirley Temple on my driver's license, I'm being oppressed. So you have Jordan Peterson's culture war, and he notes that Marxists slide under beneath postmodernity, but he pays less attention to the sacred self slide under implicit in the pronoun wars. He does pay some attention to him. I have heard him talk about that. But the focus of him has tended to be the Marxist. And a good psychologist might sit down and say, well, that's because Jordan Peterson was raised during the Cold War. And so he's got a significant amount of post-traumatic stress from the threats induced on his formed self during that period of time. So he's pretty reactive to Russian propaganda, which would say, well, that's why he pastes his house with it. Now, again, I don't know Jordan Peterson, so I'm not trying to be a psychologist, but the mind goes these places, and it could all be untrue. But this is perhaps part of the reason why he's so reactive to Marxism, and the secret sacred self is kind of slipping under the radar, and he's not paying a lot of attention to it. He himself makes accommodations to individual, and accommodation is simply pluralistic form of social lubrication. Now, the sacred self in traditional religion, there are obvious, often simplistic alignments with Buddhism and Hinduism. And this is most clearly seen in the Western variants of these, and most clearly seen in Sam Harris. So we'll hear Sam Harris kind of pivot in a lot of these conversations and say things about Hinduism and Buddhism. Now, what's interesting is that there are some alignments with the secret sacred self that's going on with Sam Harris that I'm not sure Sam Harris has fully exposed within himself. Maybe as a theistic Christian, just like Jordan Peterson is reactive to Marxism, perhaps I'm particularly reactive to secret sacred self. And if you knew a lot of my that's probably true. I'll leave it there. So we've all got our soft spots. We've all got our buttons. My woo detector, that's maybe why I can get along with a lot of atheists, because, boy, I got a woo detector in me. And so me and my older sister, who I dearly love, and we get along fabulously, but I continue to tease her and annoy her. And so often the annoyance is all over woo. And I am probably the most secular person in my family. My mother and my sisters are considerably... at least one of my sisters considerably more comfortable with woo than I am. And we see this played out, though, in society. Is yoga for physical health, or emotional well-being, or are you doing it to escape the cycle of reincarnation and eliminate the illusion of the self in your story? Go ahead and search yoga cultural appropriation, and you'll get an earful of Indians who look at the skinny, white, beautiful Americans and their fabulously profitable industry. Now, maybe Sam Harris would look at that and say, yep, they've taken religion out. Just make sure you take the statuaries and some of the symbolism, and is saying, religious? Well, Sam Harris seems to try to take the woo out of Buddhism and leave his meditation as a practice that gives me experience, which I find enjoyable. Therefore, it's safe in my woo-free clean room. So here's the thing with my videos. I get more ideas as I keep going. I might have to retitle this. Now, there's the personal versus the impersonal, though. You see, and this is, again, part of where the secret sacred self gets very interesting, because the self, rationality, a story you are attached to, keeps colonizing nature. And if everything and everyone else is impersonal, if I can see through to the materialist substrate of my wife and children and neighbors and congregants, if in fact I can see through to this, I think this is part of the latent motivation and desire beneath science. If I can figure my wife out so completely, now there's this woman I've been married to for 30 years. Oh boy, I'm talking about her. She'd get pissed off if she knows I'm talking about her. With you people, I better shut up. But imagine a theoretical wife that I imagine might have been married to for the last 30 years, who I probably know her better than any other person in the world, and there will be days that I look at her and say, do I know you at all? And she has exactly the same experience with me. And this is not an unusual experience. What does that mean? And so what is my desire? Well, my desire is to have science, and so to make the universe transparent. So how can I get my neighbor to do as I want? How can I get them to see the world as I see it? And now we're knocking on the door of Sauron in Lord of the Rings. If everything and everyone else is impersonal, the personal keeps colonizing it and appropriating its resources to serve the self. In this case, the sacred self. In theism, of course, it serves God. And this is one of the reasons why theism works better communally than the sacred self. There are in every city some church that they've got some Hinduism, they've got some Buddhism, they've got some atheism, they've got some Islam, they've got a lot of Christianity. They say all religion is the same, and in many cases these are temples to the sacred self. But they can't get the kind of communitarian power that Christianity can in its little subgroups, or Islam can in its little subgroups. And I think, again, cue Jonathan Haidt for this conversation, because going around circling in the Hajj or praying around the flagpole as the little Christians battling bad secularism in their public school that won't let them pray in the locker room or have the teachers lead in prayer. Who wants their teacher to lead in prayer? Any random teacher? That's why prayer in public schools to me has never made sense. It shows how secular I am. Maybe that's why you're listening to me, because I'm a Christian pastor, but I'm also secular. And, well, that's why I like C.S. Lewis, because I'm trying to integrate my woo. So, New Age people can't pull it together. And in fact, Hinduism, many would argue, is a label given by the British to just a stew, a religious stew that is practiced in India. And so what Western Buddhists do with Buddhism is take out the woo. This is woo-free. It's gluten-free, woo-free, and vegan. So, because Sam Harris and the Russell Brand said, well, he fell off the wagon in his vegetarianism, but he's still no woo, please. So theism, of course, has its God, and in God, everything serves the God. Again, you have a hierarchy, and when Jordan Peterson says, what is God? That which is at the top of all the hierarchies. And again, the Sam Harris people are going to say, no, that's not what we mean. is there an old man in the sky? And Jordan Peterson says, oh, yeah, that's not a terrible representation. And, off and off with, on and on we go. And the Christians will say, no, he's not an old man in the sky. Pay no attention to the Sistine Chapel. So what happens in these systems is that you get Avatar, which is Dances with Wolves, with aliens, and you get Pocahontas, and you get Dune, and you get Fern Gully. And it's all the same because the self keeps colonizing. We can't help ourselves. And in fact, what happens if you really were practicing religious yoga or religious Buddhism to the degree that they've been historically practiced, well, you're going to try in all of your life to eliminate the self, to eliminate your story, because the story is an illusion. And this is part of the reason you've got East and West conflicting here, because in a sense, what happens is, say, I really like Buddhism. I'm going to spend a lot of money decorating my house with a whole lot of heads. In fact, one of the sermons that search engines pull up most of the time in my queue of blog posts that I've done on sermons is, should you put Buddha in the bathroom? You go into a chic contemporary bathroom, and here's this Buddha statue. And I look at this and I think, as a religious person, if I walk into your bathroom and I see a big old statue of Jesus, I think, I don't want to pee by my Lord. Come on. Well, and so I did a little, Googling. How do Buddhists feel about putting Buddha in your bathroom as a decorative technique? Well, it's probably not too different from how Hindus feel about all these skinny white ladies going to yoga in North America and saying, no, it's not really religion, it's just exercise. And they're like, oh, well, see, the thing is, you have no fear of that in Christianity because we're all sitting in chairs. Maybe there's a little standing and kneeling and, there's a little bit of nutrition with the bread and the wine, but Christianity kind of took that stuff out of it. Read 1 Corinthians and Paul on the Corinthian church and their feast and how poorly that went according to Paul. Now I think in that way we can see Sam Harris as late stage materialism. Harris's attention to meditation, his trying to accommodate consciousness, these are late stage adaptations. And I think this is part of the reason why we're going to continue to see not the rise of, the long anticipated rise of materialism. No, I think it's in decline, and I think it will still decline. You might say, well, what about all the nuns, NONESs? I'd say, yeah, they're giving up formal religion and they're skeptical about God, but they're probably going to yoga and they're probably playing with meditation. They're downloading Sam Harris's app, and they're not going to be quite as reactive to woo as Sam Harris is. Woo is here to stay, boys and girls, and it just depends on how you integrate your woo. Boy, this is going to be a title. So he wants to integrate consciousness and the self into it. I think his watchers, without necessarily, I think his conscious self is resisting it, possibly because of the hierarchy. His watchers are seeing what Thomas Nagel is seeing and say, you have to bring the mind back in. You have to integrate the mind. If you don't integrate the mind, we're going to lose the whole thing. So, well, we'll call it mindfulness. Well, yeah, but I'm not sure that's integration. I think that's kind of like doing white lady yoga. Resources from Buddhism, which have become very popular, addresses phenomenology, which is a philosophical approach to the impasse. And so consciousness and materialism in him, I think, aren't well integrated. And see, what is Jordan Peterson doing? Peterson is trying, well, if we're going to think along a progressive line, Peterson is a little further down than Harris. And I think that's why, not unlike the Apostle Paul peeling off Jews from the synagogues in the book of Acts where he goes to preach, Jordan Peterson has come into the temple of Sam Harris and he's peeling off people. Why? Do we know this consciously? No, but our watchers are watching. The elephant feels it. The riders are getting nervous. The riders are beating the elephant harder. Well, what does conversion look like? Conversion looks like the rider giving up with what the elephant already believes. That's conversion. So consciousness and materialism to him don't seem well integrated. Again, it's almost like two books on a shelf, or maybe two different rooms. One is a room full of objects, and the other is a room full of moment consciousness pictures, a room full of snapshots on the wall. So he hasn't integrated these rooms. He hasn't quite figured it out, and this is why he's so hyper with story. And I think he's going to lose to story because he can't help but explain all this stuff with story. We don't have another language. And again, to build your woo-free stew, you're just not going to be able to live in this world and do it. You know, you can't even go off in a Mars colony and try to start your new world. This is the utopian hope, and it fails every time. From the moment that you, as a little fetus, heard your mama's voice, there's no hope of being free of your constructedness. It just isn't. And so once you heard your mama's voice, you're probably going to like it. At some point, you're going to hate your mama's voice, and then you're going to react to it. But ontology is its own justification. And whether you, well, let's use the biggest voice in our politics right now, whether you like Donald or hate the Donald, everything is revolving around the Donald. And so if you really want to get away from the Donald, you got to stop talking about him, because the degree to which you let the Donald in your life is the degree to which he will be in your life. So the self is the connection between conscious moment and memory. That is the story. I am a story. Relationships are a story. Civilization is a story. I think again, Peterson is right here, and I think and I've got this from Peterson, and Peterson got it from Piaget, and a host of all others. We are embodied stories, and our representations, which are the stories we tell or the stories we draw, first we act out these stories, okay? First there's drama. We act out these stories, but we cannot process this life apart from story. We just can't do it. So Yuval Harari sits down, and what he does in his meditation is he says, I meditate to eliminate all story. And that makes sense, because he's working hard in meditation to eliminate the self. And so in many ways, Harari is a hyper Sam Harris. He is, in a sense, trying to see the world without story. That's exactly what he says. I think it's on his video he does about himself explaining gayness, because he's gay apparently. So he's trying to see the world without story. He's trying to follow Sam Harris's way. But when I read Sapiens or when I read Homo Deus, why are those such engaging books? He writes story. It's the only way I can appropriate that which he tells me he sees without story. I was having a conversation with a new friend since my channel. He lives outside of Toronto. I've had some fun conversations with him. And he got into the Buddhism and story and moment and all of this, and I learned a lot from that conversation. And actually, it's Nathan. I did a video with him. I can out him. I'm not outing all of my conversation sources because I don't want to, I don't want to dirty their lives in any way by outing them. But that was Nathan, and we talked about how Buddhism works in terms of the self or the non-self, and our conversations continue in that. And I'm sure, and he tells me that my videos have been fruitful for him. My conversations with him have been fruitful for me, and so I'm trying to piece together, all of the layers, the physical layer, the story verse, the story that I am, and Theus's ship. Do I got that right? You know who I'm talking to. The ship that it's all different pieces, but it's the same ship. It's the problem of identity. If let's say all my cells are different than when I was, all my cells are different from when I was conceived. right, was that me? And now we're into the abortion question. To what degree, when David in the Psalm says, you knew me when I was conceived. Well, being God, can you know me before I exist? Well, now we're getting into theology here. And what am I? And I actually began thinking a lot of these thoughts years ago when I was trying to get my mind around the resurrection, because thinking, okay, that cremation and resurrection, and you've got being lost at sea and eaten by sharks and resurrection, and buried in a pine box and resurrection, and what exactly does God raise when he raises me? And now suddenly I have the problem of, is he going to raise the 20-year-old me? Is he going to raise the 30-year-old me? This gets into issues when people, for example, get dementia in their old age. You run into these issues as a pastor. Someone gets dementia in their old age, and they start. I knew one person, he didn't have dementia, he had aphasia, and whenever he couldn't do anything besides sing hymns and cuss. And he'd walk into church and bullshit, 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 bullshit. And his poor wife was mortified because, stop saying that. And it's like, sweetheart, we all understand. This is aphasia. He can't talk, but what's coming out is bullshit, bullshit, bullshit. It's okay. We understand that he doesn't mean bullshit. Well, where is meaning? And so where is me? And when Christ raises me and gives me a new body, how is that related to this body? And how does that connect with the fact that Jesus still had scars, but yet he could appear in a locked room and eat a fish? So what exactly will God raise when he raises me? He will raise this story. And so I talked to my friend. He watched the What is Truth video, and we have these private conversations. I have these private conversations with people, and so often I think, boy, I wish I could videotape this and put this out, because many of you would enjoy this conversation, because this is what we're talking about. So what is truth? And why do we want truth? Because we want stability. Well, why do we want stability? Because we want predictability. Why do we want predictability? Because we want to control. Why do we want to control? Because we want to ensure Sam Harris's snapshot of a pleasant consciousness existence. And we want this to keep going. And why do you get depressed when you're old? Because you pretty soon figure out this isn't going to go for long. And why do men in their midlife crisis buy red sports cars? Because they're hoping to reclaim some of what they had when they were young. And why do we have these movies where people my age or older go back and with our current mind, we have these mind-swapping movies, right? With my current mind, I go and then if I went back to college now, it wouldn't be me and it wouldn't be college. And if I could go back and do things differently, it wouldn't be the same. You can't step into the same river twice. You can't even step into the same river once. And so, what am I? What is the self? And my best answer is the self is a story. And so what does God resurrect? Well, he resurrects the body. Yeah, sort of. What he really resurrects is this me that I experience as a story. Well, what about split brain patients who one side of the brain is an atheist and the other side is a believer? And this is why I say only a God can judge. Well, why? Because a God can know all of the me's all the way back to conception. And a God can know all of what formed me in this stew we call historical culture, and the Athens that's in it, and the Greeks that are in it, and the Hebrews that are in it, and the pragmatists that are in it, and my parents and ancestors that are in it, and all the people when if I take the little DNA test and swab my tongue, all of those people that I've received the DNA from, and then the epigenetics, and only a God could see through all of this and actually do right by history. This is part of why I'm a Christian, because you might say, well, is that an old man in the sky? Well, in all fairness, representing God as an old man in the sky is something that in the Ten Commandments he said don't do. So Jesus, this is a point of argument in the Protestant Reformation. Is Jesus fair game to represent? Well, representations of Jesus are problematic. Well, why are they problematic? Because you cannot represent something in this world without initiating this whole history of constructedness. So does Jesus have red hair and blue eyes, or blonde hair and blue eyes? And is Jesus good looking, or is he without form or comeliness, as the old translation of Isaiah says, and on and on and on and on. And this is why we have all these conversations. So this is where we're at. So the self is the connection between the conscious moment and the memory. I am a story. My relationships are a story. My marriage is a story. My relationships with children are a story. My relationships with this church are a story. And they're connected with all kinds of layers, and they're connected with history, and they're connected with my body, and they're connected with the stories that have gone before. And it's one enormously, unbelievably complicated ball, the likes of which, given that I am conscious for maybe only 16 to 20 hours of every 24-hour period of an 80 to 90-year lifespan, can only barely touch, even though my watchers are processing and knowing far more than I can, but my memory is limited, and snapshots can add things that I don't know. And here we are in the midst of all this. And so story is the best that I can do. I am a story. My relationships are stories. Civilization is a story. America is a story. Story scales and connects and even subsumes the individual into larger narratives. And so postmodernity says we can't handle these stories, and they have a point. But who could? God. So, well, let's say you don't believe in a man in the sky, or you don't believe in a literal being. Well, something is functioning out there, and something exists out there. And again, I get back to my ontological argument. It would be a terrible shame if there was actually no finally such thing as justice or history or anything else, because all we are is some strange byproduct, evolutionary byproduct of, well, that doesn't make sense either, because why are we here at all? There have been times when I try to be an atheist mentally, and I just can't get there. I really just can't get there, because you say, well, swallow, give me, the old story, give me one miracle, the Big Bang at the beginning, and I'll explain the rest. Well, first of all, I don't have time to listen to your explanation. And secondly, the parts that I've seen and the deeper I look into them don't seem to mesh. And now for many of you, you say the same thing about my religion. I get that. But I'm just telling you what I think. Now, Buddhism. There is a skepticism regarding me and my story that my friend and I talked about. And it was a really helpful conversation. And the skepticism can be validated by experience. And this is what you get with Sam Harris and his meditation and his psychedelics. The question is always, and so there's someone in my meetup who's got a PhD in neuropsychology, and you talk to him about these drugs. He's got a very different opinion about these drugs, and maybe I'll have to have him. He probably doesn't want to be on here because YouTube is a place for people with not a lot to lose, and I'm a pastor of a small church, so I don't have a lot to lose, but he's got a career to think about. And so actually one of my sons says, someone said, maybe I should, it's tempted to go on video, and I told my son, don't go on YouTube. You're too young. You've got too much to lose by your 20-year-old self spitting out what you think now. Tim Keller was asked once, why didn't he write books until his 50s? Because he said, anything I wrote in my 20s, I'd probably want to burn now. Sorry, all you 20-year-olds. That's how it feels to be a 50-year-old. And so he waited till his 50s because they thought, well, maybe now I know enough to be helpful. And I'm young enough to still be able to write. And I get that. And I think that's part of the reason I'm glad we're seeing the Jordan Peterson we're seeing now, because he's gotten a lot of his stuff worked through. He's sorted himself out in a lot of ways. And pardon me, but my facile appearances of watching a guy closely for a year, did he win the cortical lottery that Jonathan Haidt talks about? He seems to struggle with depression, and he's talked about that. And he's built for himself a stable marriage and a good family. And I think part of what makes his story attractive to a lot of people is that he shows people that, you don't have to be born with the body of LeBron James to really excel in hierarchies in this world. You can build a good marriage, and you can build a good family, and you can build a good life, and you can impact the world. There can be meaning. And I think that's a compelling aspect of his story and his late rise to fame and his late status rocket. And again, we have no idea where this whole thing is going to go. But do psychedelics actually make us more informed of the truth, or do they just shut off certain portions of our brain so that we're dumber? And it's kind of like the question of the drunk who says, "I drive better when I've had a few drinks." Why? Because I pay more attention. Now, almost everyone will say, "Well, yeah, a certain part of your mind is paying attention, but your whole mind is compromised by the alcohol." So now we're back into the question, well, what is the real world? Well, the secret sacred self really loves being on the drugs because I feel like I'm full of power. Or the secret sacred self loves watching a movie in IMAX because there's a funny thing that happens when I watch things on screen. I identify with them and I connect with them. And when I watch Star Wars, I feel like Luke Skywalker or Princess Leia or Darth Vader. Who knows who you feel like? So there's some skepticism regarding me and my story, and the skepticism can be validated by experience. And this fits into dominant materialist paradigm, and that's what's, so the Western, my friends, and it's not just Nathan, my friends, other friends in my regular world who are deep into meditation and Buddhism, they tell me, well, this is helping me handle my life better, partly because this is helping me handle me better. I'm in better control of myself. Same thing happens with therapy. Same thing happens with Christian discipleship. And so in that sense, you look at this and say, well, all these religions are the same. Yeah, at some levels, they're very similar. But at other levels, when you get into the narrative levels, they're different. And I, as a Christian, am looking for something very different than an accomplished yogi who is trying to break the cycle of reincarnation. I have no plans of coming back into this world and continuing to work on my stuff. And now Catholics and to a degree Orthodox might say, well, you've got purgatory to look for. Protestants, because of our history of dealing with the Bible, say, God will do it somehow, but we're not going to speculate how. So we're not going to speculate about purgatory. We're not going to write about it. We can think about it, but I can't talk about it publicly. And some people keep asking me in the comments, have you converted to Roman Catholicism yet? No. And other people write me letters and say, sure, I'm glad you're doing this as a Protestant, not like those old Catholics. So yeah, there you go. Tribalism. It fits into the dominant materialist paradigm, but it also flirts with materialist nihilism. And that's the thing, because if I convince myself that I am not a story, or that my story itself is an illusion, well, I really do want my story to continue, and I really do want my story to get better. And that's where you're really engaging Christianity, where your individualist story that I connect. Now you get into the Bible, you get into the book of Revelation, you're given a new name. Now that means things exegetically and in terms of the symbolic story of the Bible. But as a Christian, I anticipate bringing, and I have no idea how this can work. Again, I've been thinking about this for years. I anticipate whatever the me that is, seeing the God that is, and we can't help but use stories and representations with this, with my own eyes. This is the language of the Bible. But there is a meanness that transcends, so that the disciples, when they see Jesus, there's definitely identity confusion and dissonance that's going on there. But Jesus is very clear, it is I. And we see this in Lord of the Rings with Gandalf the White versus Gandalf the Gray. And Peter Jackson has some of that in the movies. You can see some of that Gandalf the White is Gandalf, but he's a perfected Gandalf. And C.S. Lewis talks this about us, and the Apostle Paul talks this about us, that the Paul Vanderklay that will reign with Christ in the new heavens and the new earth will be a perfected Paul Vanderklay. It won't be this Paul Vanderklay subject to decay, but it will be the Paul Vanderklay that, and again, how to language this stuff that should always have been. C.S. Lewis deals with this in his Narnia Chronicles, especially the last battle, which is one of my favorites of the Narnia Chronicles, because this is terribly difficult for us to talk about. And you get into Paul writing about, someone caught up in the third heaven, wink, wink, it was Paul. Things that are ineffable. What does that mean? He can't talk about them because, and this again is someone who's on psychedelics will say, well, I can't talk about this. So is that the brain shutting down like some materials? Well, when we die, our brain shuts down and then we have the tunnel of light and we go for it. And so very interesting near-death experiences have some commonalities to psychedelic experiences. And someone might argue, materialism confirmed. When the brain shuts down, we have these crazy experiences. When I take psychedelics, the brain shuts down, we have these crazy experiences. I can achieve these things through maybe being in a zero, in a tank where there's zero input. If you go into a very dark cave, you will start to see hallucinations. We know this. Our minds are chattery, and if we stop input, our minds will pick up the story and work out their own stuff inside of us. We know this. And so meditation, well, what is meditation? Well, is this what we're doing? So then Sam Harris, if he wants to keep his materialist credentials, which are, again, suspect for a lot of people, if he wants to keep his materialist credentials, what he might say is that through meditation, I intentionally shut down parts of my brain, but it's all still within my brain. And this is where Jung and his collective unconscious gets into trouble. And yes, this is what's so interesting about Peterson, because he's pinging so many different communities and bringing them into one conversation. And so now we have the Christians and the Jungians and the Christian Jungians and the Christians who write me and say, Jung is an occult leader, stay away from him and don't talk to those people. I get not crazy letters. I get lovely letters from people. And again, your letters are lovely. And if I missed your letter, I'm sorry. I can't keep up with all of them. But I wish I could. I wish I weren't bound to 24/7. But again, I'm a Christian. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, I've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. And part of my anticipation of the new heavens and the new earth is that I will get to spend, see, now I say eternity because everlasting is different from eternity. I will get to everlastingly, because eternity is really more of a category than a time frame. I will get to everlastingly enjoy incredible conversations with all of the people that can stand the presence of God and that Jesus brings in as his friends. There's a little Dallas Willard in there, obviously. But I will get a chance to, now look, read Peter Kreeft books. Peter Kreeft, brings Socrates into heaven. Peter Kreeft is an interesting guy. But I will get a chance to talk and to enjoy and this will be at all layers in the new heavens and the new earth. So it's represented as a banquet. And so my father passed away when he was having a conversation with someone. And my father died doing what he loved to do. He was sitting at a table and he was having coffee with someone. And the waitress came and asked if he wanted coffee. And my father always said yes to coffee. And he paused and he had a heart attack and he died on the spot. And when I thought about that, I thought about the fact that he wasn't planning on going, because I talked to him the day before. He'd had some health issues. And I said, how do you feel, Dad? Fine. He was a little annoyed with us because there was nothing wrong with me. And he died the next day. But he went to sleep in the coffee shop, and he woke up in the banquet of the Lamb, where God brings into his harvest the fruit that he has sown in the cultural stories of the world. And so the banquet of the Lamb won't be limited to the food that Jesus ate in first century Palestine. There will be foods from every corner of the world. Now you get into my Calvinist Kuyperianism, all of which God looks at and says, this is mine. I am the God, and I will claim these. And then we think, what about me? But let me tell you about this God. Why is the world so filled with glory? Because he loves to share. And he loves to share. God, the sun shines on the just and the unjust. God loves to share even with people who don't deserve it. And this is my God, and this is my joy as being a Christian. And, well, why? Some of you have commented in letters, Paul, you're too nice. Well, I can be not nice. And truth be told, you don't want to see me when I'm not nice. But life is too short to waste on a lot of egoistic self-indulgences. And I know that now as a 50-year-old, having wasted a lot of time. And yeah, there are ways that you can trigger me. And there are buttons that you will push. And I'll not tell you where they all are because I'm not stupid. But whether it's the homeless alcoholic or the determined atheist. Are you saying atheism and alcoholism are the same thing? No. Or the person struggling with their gender identity, or human beings are made in the image of God, and they are amazing beyond description. They are also sometimes evil beyond imagination. And I have to figure out what my best approach towards people are. Usually getting mad at them doesn't do much except indulge my inner angry man. Boy, I'm rambling in this one. So you get the politics of transgenderism. Why does this area spark debate? It's a tiny element, but it's a growing element because we are not disconnected from our environment, and we see this with suicide and depression. To what degree is the storyverse on gender shaping individual stories on gender? And I've got a lot of concern. I've got a lot of concern in this area, partly because I think kids are being, what happens? There was a very interesting article written in The Atlantic on transgender. What happens when a confused 13-year-old says, Mom, I think I'm a boy in a girl's body? And what happens when the mom has been primed because of signaling, because of virtue signaling, because of not wanting to be a bigot, because of wanting to be part of the ascendant morality herd, because they've, without even knowing it, deeply imbibed the religion of the secret self, and oh my goodness, and then rushes out, and in the case of this one Australian woman, starts giving, I think it was a boy, starts giving her son estrogen, and because that she was getting it for hot flashes or something. And well, this starts making changes in the body, and a few years later, no, that was a mistake. Well, what would have happened if surgery had happened and drugs had scorched the person's reproductive system? They're at what was a struggle at an age of 13 that is more and more common because we watch each other and we learn from each other. And especially when you're young, you're leaving the parents and you're bonding with your peers, and everyone is saying to be a certain thing is high status and to be another thing is low status. Well, we had all this angst about to be a beautiful, wealthy football player is high status, and to be a poor, ugly nerd who loves math and chess is low status. Or with women, to look like an airbrush supermodel in a magazine is high status, and then body image issues with people is low status, and that then triggers bulimia and eating disorders. What disorders are we triggering by rejiggering this system that we are living within? We have no idea. But early indications are there's loss that's happening. Because as Peterson, I think, says so well, if we're functioning at 85%, to get to 90 is really hard, but it doesn't take much to drop to 60. And the fear is that that's what's happening in a number of areas. We're tinkering with things we don't know enough about. And so to what degree is the storyverse on gender shaping individual stories on gender? We see the same connection in depression, identity, meaning, and status. I am not an island. I am a story, and I am deeply tied to all the stories around me, and I care deeply about the way in which this story that I identify as me is in all of the other stories. That, in fact, is where the hierarchies come in. And every story that you invest in exchanges suffering for meaning. So I'll undergo the surgery because I think that'll fix my problem. But what if it doesn't? Every movie we see is an exchange of suffering for meaning. If a story has no challenge, you are bored with it and look for a challenge and drama. Look at the arc of every American movie. There's a challenge, and the protagonist overcomes the challenge and is transformed by it. This is the hero's journey. This is Star Wars. This is Lord of the Rings. This is James Bond. This is every single movie. Now, you can find movies, usually art house films, where you have suffering and no meaning. And the only way you can enjoy a story like that is actually if you're put together solidly enough to say, oh man, that's deep. But I would argue that story is, again, colonizing the moments and the world of objects in through that. We see this playing out in the fandoms. And, you know, so my friend was talking about, and the Reddit people talking about, you know, most of the people in Vancouver were Sam Harris fans. And so the Sam Harris fans would cheer when Sam made a point that they thought was a winning point. You know what? When you do that, you're participating in the storyverse. You're indulging in the storyverse. You would have to be Spock-like to sit back and say, Sam made a good point. But there's no feelings. But remember, Spock was only half Vulcan. So movies with all suffering and no meaning are hated by Americans and relished by people who find their meaning in embracing meaninglessness, which is a story. I don't know that you can embrace anything without story because, again, look at what we've done. What is embrace? It's this. First we act out, then we represent it in words. And for all of the ways I disagree with Jordan Peterson, some of these things that he taught me I think are dead on right about us. And that's one of them. Just look at it. To embrace something means what? It's a drama that we have represented in words, and it's now become abstracted. And that's the only way we can talk. It's the only way we can think. You know, it's the only thing we can do. It's just how we are. So materialism has a meaning problem. There's no meaning for objects in space, so story colonizes it. And whether or not you want to fess up to your story, well, you'd not watch that movie. It'd be a snapshot. It would be fruit in a bowl. There is more meaning in a forum for action than there is in fruit in a bowl. So listening to my witnesses that went to the event in Vancouver, the Sam Harris fandom doesn't seem to smile much. Maybe that's a cheap shot. I don't know. So if you're a smiling Sam Harris person, let me know. And I think part of the reason is that it's kind of a dour view. And atheism has always had a certain dour nature to it. And it's not, you know, this is where the Melanie Brewster video that I played comes in. Churches, part of what we do, we come together to mourn, but we also come together to celebrate. Well, what do we celebrate? The resurrection. Well, that seems weird. Why would we celebrate something that we can't demonstrate to Sam Harris, but it happened 2,000 years ago? Because it's a story that colonizes my story. So the story of the resurrection colonizes the story that is Paul Vanderklay. And how does it change it? Well, it changes it to the degree that I can serve alcoholics who are homeless. And I can serve a small church. And I can serve the 7,000 some odd of you out there in YouTube land. And I can serve, and I can serve, and I can serve. Because the resurrection story has colonized my story. And has it got woo in it? Yeah, it's got woo in it. It's got a lot of woo. Because mind and physics are integrated. because my God is the Lord of physics. And when Jesus walks on water, well, he's walking on water because water is his servant and it obeys him, just like my hand is my servant. Now, this is where I'm still rolling in my head a video about woo. It'll be about woo now, and about natural and supernatural. Is it supernatural when my hand moves? Now, again, something happens in my brain. I decide to move my hand. My hand, my nervous system is extended in my body, but is it woo that moves my hand? And so the MMA fighter says, it's all woo, baby. And in that sense, he's right, if mind and matter are integrated. And Jesus walking on water the water was obedient to Jesus as my hand is obedient to me now. In fact, the water is probably more obedient because there are lots of ways in which nature can disrupt my hand moving. If I have a stroke, maybe the right side will be paralyzed, so on and so forth. So, and this is C.S. Lewis, reason colonizes nature. Jesus colonizes nature. The story verse colonizes the matter verse. That's why this water bottle is the shape it is. We have colonized it very well. We are pretty earnest about winning. Winning is a story value which we derive significant meaning and ego rewards. Is this borrowed meaning for the Sam Harris folks who cheered during the conference in the middle of the points? They're winning. That's why they cheer. C.S. Lewis, trying to explain church to people, says praise is inner health made audible. Why do we worship? We celebrate the resurrection. Why do churches meet on Sunday? They celebrate the resurrection. Why do churches celebrate the Eucharist or Lord's Supper or communion? We celebrate the resurrection. The witness said Harris's disposition on stage was telling. He was sitting there and he was ready to shoot down all the arguments that came. Not only is world a space for objects, I am an object and my thoughts are facts and I'm going to shoot down non-facts. That's the worldview. Peterson was more engaged, leaning forward, and when the video comes out, I suspect we'll all get a chance to see this, Peterson was leaning forward and said, he was listening. Also, again, as I mentioned earlier, status-wise, we'll have to see if Peterson hardens in his status or if he remains, for lack of a better word, supple. I think that's been one of the most attractive elements of his persona in this, is he has remained supple. And when I had my little conversation with him, that was one of the things that impressed my watchers most, is this guy is having a conversation. Now tonight, I'll shake his hand, Lord willing, at the event in Sacramento, and I'll get my picture taken, and I'll post the picture so y'all can see. And, we'll see what happens. But here's something that happens when you're famous. If you go to the website, you could probably find it and dig it up. You can find where this particular vendor of photographs posts all the photographs that you can find them. And so what happens when your picture is taken with tens of thousands of people? Well, you get less supple. That's part of what happens. So Peterson is still supple. He's not jaded. And, we've been having this conversation about his giving interviews. So why am I so fascinated in Peterson? Well, I'm learning from him. I'm learning not just from the content that he's giving. I'm learning not just from the facts, but I'm learning from a whole other range of facts from watching. And there's vicariousness to him. He's about my same age. And I was talking to my wife about him the other day. I keep bringing my wife into this. If she knew this. Because she doesn't trust any of you out there. Sorry. So if you come tonight and you see her, don't say hi to her. She's not. Maybe I'll edit this out. No, I won't. So there's vicarious things going on with Peterson and me, obviously. And anyone outside would say, well, you're about the same age, and temperamentally there's some similarities. There's huge dissimilarities, but I'm enjoying watching him and I'm learning from it. And there's vicariousness. What if this had happened to me? Part of me thinks, oh, would I like the money and the fame? Part of me would. Would I like the disruption in my life? No. Do I want my kids actually getting that kind of attention in their 20s? Frankly, no. You know, I see these people bringing their children up to be child stars, and I think, what are you, nuts? That's one sure way to ruin your kid. But, you know, Peterson seems put together, and his daughter seems to be interested in this phenomenon and participating. And, you know, the older you get, the better equipped you are to deal with this stuff. I look at these basketball players in their 20s getting all of this fame and all of this money, or football players, and I think, this is a bad thing. But, hey, after 18 or 21, you can do what you want. So you take the bad with the good. And a lot of people fail the challenge. And people are like, yes, Lord, test me with the lottery. Well, the real fact is most people fail those tests. And the fact that we think we would survive them is usually self-bias. So why do we watch? We're watching a story, and we like the story. And that's what's interesting to us. We see our own story nested within the larger story. The story is higher up the value hierarchy than the objects. And I caught on Reddit this comment about Elton John's cup. Why? And, you know, I'm surprised. I hope Peterson pounced on that, because to me, and now, again, it's really hard when you're on stage and doing this in front of people, and it's really easy to be sitting back and watching it and having thoughts in your own office when you don't have all that pressure on you. It's like, you know, sinking that free throw at the NBA Finals versus shooting in your backyard. But, you know, Elton John's cup is the perfect illustration of hierarchy, because if Elton John's lips touched the cup, suddenly that cup would be a different cup. And even if well, let's say, you know, you do this with signatures, with, you know, autographs. Oh, I should take my book tonight. I have him autograph my book. I didn't think of that. I'll probably forget. Maybe I should have him autograph Bucko. What do you say, Bucko? You want to go to the event tonight? I'll see Vlado. Vlado bought Bucko, and so Vlado gets the credit. But, well, it should bring Vlado. I should find my hard copy of 12 Rules that I got in the simulation event in San Francisco. So, should finish my video. See, this is why I do PowerPoint, because I ramble. Our watchers want to watch and prod the conscious self to pay attention. This is why we watch. We watch because there's stuff to learn. And those of you who are Sam Harris fans have learned stuff from Sam Harris, and so feel gratitude towards him. And if you're a Jordan Peterson fan, you've learned from Jordan Peterson and feel gratitude towards him. And that's the whole business with Patreon, which I didn't understand in Peterson when he explained why he started Patreon. He said, people feel grateful and want to express it. And I think, why would people want to send me money? They feel grateful for me making these videos. And I get letters all the time from people that say, thank you for making these videos. Keep making them. And part of me thinks, would I watch these videos? I don't know. But I'm watching Peterson's videos, and I'm making these videos because making them helps me think it out. And I don't fully understand this whole dynamic. And will it come to an end someday? Yeah, I'll die. What comes next? I have no idea. Will my videos merge from Peterson onto other topics? Could be. How long will I be on Jordan Peterson? Well, I was on Tim Keller for 10 years. What's going to happen to Jordan Peterson? We have no idea. So we watch because we watch the story and we're interested, and we might not even know why we watch the story. And some of you have said, I've stopped watching Jordan Peterson and I only watch you. So thank you. It's easier to contact me than it is to contact Jordan Peterson. But the more subs I get, the harder that is. So, you know, but maybe it won't go anywhere. And a part of me really hopes it doesn't, because having lunch with some of you, or having you come to the meetup, or meeting you tonight, or I'm having a ball. And, well, yeah, if I had 100,000 subs and sponsors and I could give up my day job. See, here's the thing about, I don't know, and, you know, what question do you want to ask Peterson? I'm not going to ask questions that want to prod him towards Christianity, because I can't imagine how tired he is at the end of a show. I have more questions about, you know, are you going to keep teaching at the university? When are you going to start the biblical lectures? those are my kind of questions. And they're, again, personal questions. And they're questions that involve the story that is Jordan Peterson. And this is what the fun of this is for me, because apparently I'm an extrovert. I have to be, really, in many ways. And so when someone pops up and says, boy, Paul, thanks for making these videos. These have been helpful. I'd kind of like to know why they've been helpful. I'd kind of like to know a little bit of your story. And it's cool. It's just really cool. And these are good things. And this is why Jordan Peterson, when he can't answer all his mail, stops and is moved by people saying, I read your book and it helped me. There are so few better things we can do in this world than that, than to help someone. And let's give some credit to Sam Harris in this, okay? To have someone say, my stream of conscious memories that I identify as a story, it's better. My story is better since learning from you. That's wonderful. And when therapists hear that, they cheer. And as a pastor, do I want people to come to Christ? Absolutely. Do I want people to become Christians? Absolutely. Do I want people to come to my church? That flatters me. Do I want all of those things? Yes. But when someone comes to me and says, I'm still an atheist, but you've been helpful to me. Thank you. Why? I love that. It's affirming. And I think God loves that too. Well, am I projecting up onto God? Yeah, could be. And some Christians in my audience might take issue with what I just said. But this gets part of my priesthood of all believers Calvinism, where, if you are being a good farmer, then that is God's calling for you to be a good farmer. And if you are a truck driver, and you're being a truck driver to the glory of God, you are working in God's kingdom. And if you are a better father, and this is, do I want to make Tony Soprano a better mob boss? I'd like it better if he'd give up the protection racket and the murder and the prostitution and all of these things. But even if Tony Soprano came to me and said, I feel better because of you, I would say, I'll take that as a plus. So I've wandered too much. I don't want to make another 2-hour one. I know some of you say, the longer the better, but here it is. So, yep, I'm going to see Jordan Peterson tonight, and Lord willing, in the VIP thing, I'll probably shake his hand, and he might remember me. I've had a conversation and done some videos about him, but I don't have high expectations for any of that. I'd like to hear him talk about his plans for the future. But I'd like to hear how, if I had a chance to sit down with him, I could sit down with him for hours. I'd talk about him for hours. A conversation with him for hours would be easy. But I'd have a lot of questions, probably more about, so what are you going to do for me? Which is, when are you going to start the biblical lectures again? I really want to hear what you do with Exodus. I really love to know what you're going to do with Leviticus. I'm kind of set up for being disappointed, but because Leviticus is a really hard book, but it's a really cool book. And then there's the rest of the Bible, which you'll never get to. But thank you all for watching. It's been great. I'm not signing off. I intend to do more videos, but it's just sincerest thanks to all of you who have written me, and those of you who support me on Patreon. I really, when I started this Patreon business, I was very hesitant, and then when I started it, I thought I shouldn't do pay-for-play things, because I don't like that as a pastor. I don't like, because there are a few people in my church who are very generous with their money, I can spend a lot of time with other people in the church and other people in the community who don't have any money. That is a great system, and it's the system of the church. Patreon doesn't work with that system. Patreon is pay to play, and I thought, I don't want to do pay to play things on Patreon. That would probably bump up the amount of money I get on Patreon, and no more money's better than less money. But the more I think about it, I think, well, you should do pay-to-play things on Patreon to say thank you to your Patreon supporters. And I should get this because I'm the pastor that says misery, deliverance, gratitude. But so on and so forth. And I'm working with the deacons to set up online giving if you'd like to donate to my church. Donations to the church, if you file taxes to the United States government, donations to my church are tax deductible. They're not to Patreon. So that's an upside. And donations given to my church don't come to me. They just go to support the church. And because the church has been supportive of my videos, I'm happy when people donate to the church, because this keeps me going. If I had a different council and they'd say, no more videos on church time, I don't know how I'd do that, because pastors' times are really flexible. But also, I would probably have less opportunity for making videos. But as those of you who are watching my Sunday sermons on my church channel can see, my videos, my talking at this strange contraption bleeds into my sermons and vice versa, because I'm all one me and I'm all one story, and all these stories are coming down into me. So I told myself I was going to shut up 9 minutes ago, and I'm shutting up now. Should I re-entitle this story with woo in it? I don't know.